Please join me in welcoming the panelist as well as our moderator for today, Rina Fraticelli.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you so much to TIFF Higher Learning and to Teresa Scandifio, who I know can't be here today. She's off at the Learneds. But it was a really great opportunity to take the discussions which were happening with increasing, I think, energy and insight around the community onto this stage and bring it to this very interesting mix of constituencies. And the timing was so great with the launch this morning of the Focus on Women report through CUES, a new organization, not really organization, association of unions and guilds, media unions and guilds, and our last week release of the new Women in View report, the launch, I hope, of an annual series of reports on women in television. Just to tell you a little bit about what we plan to do today, I'll introduce my esteemed, I'm so thrilled about this panel. I'll introduce the panelists in just a moment. I just wanted to give you a little sense of the context of this. Over the last few years, there's been a slight but marked change, I think, in the perception of the gendering of media. We had a kind of a black hole period, at least in my experience, it was kind of like a black hole period where there was just a sense that what's the problem? There is no problem. And I think that gap in understanding, coupled with, I think, a degenerating situation in terms of both the representation and the employment of women, led a few people across the country in different jurisdictions to start doing some work to just get hard figures and hard numbers. And that's been happening with some regularity over the last little while. And, you know, one of the people who has brought this to the surface is John Doyle, who's one of the panelists, and he wrote a few very compelling reviews over the last couple of years, observing trends that he saw on television, both here and in the U.S. And so in the desire to make certain things more clear, more concrete, more accessible, we undertook to do some documenting. And so in this report that Women in View launched last week, we looked at some just very big overview themes, a small number of employment categories, but we think a very influential categories: directing, writing, cinematography. And directing and writing particularly because of the domino effect that happens based on who is behind the camera, who's calling the shots, who's writing the scripts, and what happens in terms of employment on screen and then the consumption of those images among all of us. Dr. Stacy Smith from the Geena Davis Foundation and the University of Southern California will talk about some really exciting work that she's been doing. And just to introduce and provide a Canadian context for that, I'd just like to show a couple of slides from our television report last week. Let me just bring the first one up if I know how to do this. Yay! Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea. So we looked at 21 television series that were funded through the Canada Television Fund, and to look at who was directing. And so that gives you a pretty good sense. We also looked at the number of episodes per director, women and men, and that just spoke to us about employment, employability, survivability in terms of profession. That's just, I know these are just glimpses. There won't be an exam, so it's okay. Screenwriters is a little bit better, or it was in that catchment, and this is just looking at one catchment, 2010-2011, funding through the CTF, and we chose that particular cluster because we wanted to look at funding that was public, so that we all are owners of that funding, so we have a stake in it. So it's a little bit better, but not much. Cinematographers, not so much. So that's pretty bad, and there's lots to be said about that. There's going to be more to be said about all this than we can ever get to today, I mean. This is even worse, right? So, you know, for me, the big picture is, where's the diversity of Canada, the thing we always, you know, trot out as our great distinguishing feature that we're so proud of? Where is that reflected in terms of the cultural content that supposedly this funding is there to protect? You know, who's Canada, who's Canadian content are we protecting? I hope I don't sound bitter. First Nations women, similarly grim. So that I wanted to kind of create that general picture that was coming through very, very starkly, led to the idea to have this panel. And the first person I'd like to invite to speak is someone who has really created an important standard, both in the United States and in Canada, and whose work offers something that we need very badly in this country. And I'm happy to say that we've now started to develop, which is an annual report. So you can track things over time. You can see what's an anomaly. Was, you know, did the dollar rise? You know, was there a writer's strike? Whatever. So you can just see a more continuous pattern, and you can deal with it. And you also come up with more informed, intelligent remedies. So Dr. Stacy Smith, Associate Professor at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, is a renowned expert and author of more than 75 articles on content patterns and effects of the media. She's been a lead researcher for the Geena Davis Foundation, which does phenomenal work in terms of, well, all kinds of representation, but a particular interest in the representation of men and women in children's programming and the impact that has. And it's a very interesting strategy for an organization to use to go and actually talk to studio heads and people in power in studios to bring these facts back to them, because we've observed a real gap between what people think is going on and what the numbers tell us. Very excitingly, the WIFT LA and the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival have been working with Dr. Smith to examine gender difference in submissions and selection, so submission and results, at the Sundance Institute and the festival. And Stacy, who I had the great pleasure of meeting a few years ago at our major SEXMONEYMEDIA conference, and who sort of introduced me to this very deep and nuanced level of work that she's doing, is going to talk about some of her more recent work. Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, it's great to be here today, and Rina, I want to congratulate you and everyone who participated in the Women in View report. It's outstanding. I had a chance to look at it last night and on the flight, and I couldn't be more proud of the work that you're doing here. Today, what I'd like to do is overview some of the current research we've been working on at the Annenberg School, looking at gender and entertainment, primarily through the lens of the United States. Though I do have a disclaimer before I begin. Some of the statistics are quite bad, so I might bring the mood down a bit. So I just wanted to offer that warning or disclaimer ahead of time before we get started. What I'd like to do is just overview 3 central trends that we found in our work, and then pass it along to the panel. One of our first major findings of a report we just released in the last 3 weeks at the beginning of May is that we've found that females are still sidelined in popular top-grossing films. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, at the Annenberg School, which is the institution that funded this particular project, we look at the frequency of females on screen. So we're talking now about every character that speaks on screen one or more words discernibly and overtly. We're demographers in some senses, and I think it's really important when we think about visibility to find out how often females are actually shown on screen in popular top-grossing films. So for a study we just released, we looked at the prevalence of female speaking characters across 500 of the top grossing films from 2007 to 2012. And as you can see from the first row here, if we look at the percentage of female characters, one or more words overtly on screen, you'll see that females represent less than 1/3 of all speaking characters out of more than 4,000 characters evaluated per year. Despite being 50% of the population in North America and purchasing 50% of the tickets at the box office, females are still grossly underrepresented on screen. If we look at the percentage of balanced cast, featuring 45 to 55% of all speaking characters on screen as girls or women, we see very few films are balanced. And the most recent years that we evaluated, 2010 and 2012, are the most imbalanced. If we look at the ratio, it can range anywhere from 2.05 male speaking characters to 1 female, or in 2012, 2.51 to 1. Okay, so gross underrepresentation on screen. Now, if on screen is bad in the top grossing films, behind the camera is even more abysmal. If we look at employment patterns, for the exact same 5 years, looking at, usually it's over 1,000 individuals working behind the screen as directors, writers, or producers, we see that once again, females are grossly underrepresented. In the directing position, it's anywhere from 2.7 as a low to 8% as a high. Very few females are directors. Now, I'm not going to talk much about diversity in this presentation, but there were only 3 African American women, if I recall correctly, as directors across these 5 years. Now, if we look at writers, it's a little bit better, but not much, and female producers represent about 20% of all producers working on the top grossing films across these 5 years. Now, for a study that was conducted and supported by the Geena Davis Institute, we were wondering why things were so abysmal for women on screen. On screen, not behind the camera. We were curious, why is there so few speaking characters on screen? Now, obviously, there's some intuitive answers that would come to mind. But rather than focusing on opinion or perception, we decided to interview over 100 content creators, thought leaders in the entertainment industry, take them our data, and ask them what accounts for these low numbers. Rather than them telling us that things are getting better or worse, we showed them the numbers, showed them, based on other work we had done, that there's been no change in the presence of women on screen in over 20 years, and asked them what accounts for the gross underrepresentation of women on screen. Those over 100 content creators' answers to these questions were content analyzed, and we looked at the themes that emerged across their responses. Here's what we were told, or the major reasons for the infrequency of females in film on screen. Few couple of major reasons emerge across the content creators and thought leaders' responses. 2 I want to point out as probably the most important: positive male market forces and negative female market forces. Things that pull male leads, tent poles, comic books, male-driven content sell. But if you have female leads, female-driven content, female storylines, they don't sell. What content creators are doing, which is no big surprise because people have been writing about that, is conflating or confounding gender of the lead character with production cost, widest point of release, marketing budgets. These 2 things are confounded. If you have a male lead, you have a higher budget. If you have a female lead, you typically have a lower budget. We've done sophisticated statistical analyses controlling for production costs, widest point of release, 12 production, distribution, and exhibition factors, and actually found that in 2007, gender of the lead character doesn't make an impact on domestic box office performance. What does? How much money you put into the film, how widely you release it, and the strength of the story. No big surprise, okay? A couple of other factors: male-dominated industry. Males write what they know, they direct what they know, so we'll see a skew on screen. People are targeting the male audience, despite females representing 50% of all ticket holders, and that the quintessential mythologizing of girls will watch stories about boys, but boys won't watch stories about girls. 17% spontaneously indicated this, but when we asked a forced choice, yes, no, or maybe, over 85% of content creators gave this as one of the reasons for not creating content with female-driven storylines. So as you can see, these are typically what we see written about in the popular press, but they're also part of the mythologizing that takes place in the industry. Now, what would happen if we put women behind the camera? We've been asking this question with quite a bit of our research to see if there's a difference. Do things change on screen when you have a woman behind the camera? So what we've done with these 500 films is we put them into two buckets. Those films with a female director versus those without a female director. Those with a female writer and those without a female writer. And then we looked at the percentage of females on screen to see if it changes. Are females more likely to tell stories with other female characters? Here's what we found. If you have no behind-the-scenes female as a writer, 28.6% of all your characters on screen are female. But if you have a female writer involved, the number of female characters on screen jumps to 37%. The difference is even more pronounced with directors. 30% of all on-screen characters are female when you do not have a female director, but when you do, it's almost 41%. There's possibly two explanations for these findings. One is that females are advocating for other females, or it's that females are relegated to tell stories and are greenlit stories by studios that feature more female characters, okay? Those often have lower production costs and aren't widely as distributed as the big tentpole films. Our second major finding, still focusing on content, is that females are still sexualized in popular top-grossing films. We've been looking at the hypersexualization of media characters for quite some time, knowing that the research suggests that it can lead for some girls and young women to body shame, appearance anxiety, and a whole series of other negative outcomes. And if we look across all the years at some of our sexualization indicators, you can see that the percentage of females, which are often 2 to 3 times as great as the percentage of males, statistically significant across the percentage shown in sexy attire, with some or full nudity, and referenced as attractive, females at a higher rate than males are shown across every year in terms of sexualization. Now, also, we found with quite a bit of research that females are more likely to be shown as thin than their male counterparts. No big surprise. Sometimes in animation, if you think Ariel or Belle, these characters are so thin that the circumference of their waist approximates their upper arm. And we like to say at the Annenberg School that these gals have no room for a womb or any other internal organ. All right. Now, what's quite problematic is we looked across 5 years at age and how age intersects with the sexualization of characters. And what you can see here is a trend that is somewhat problematic. If you look at the yellow line, which is teenage females, which is what the concern of the American Psychological Association is in terms of the task force looking at these particular issues, we see that there is a dramatic increase in the rise of teen female sexualization over and above 21 to 39-year-olds or 40 to 64-year-olds as well. Same patterns for partial nudity too. Okay, so we're seeing a dramatic increase over just the last couple of years in teen female sexualization. All right. Now, my third and final point, and I hope I'm okay on time. Rina, am I okay on time? Okay. I wanted to end on some happy news. So maybe to see where things are a little bit better for women in entertainment. And a study that we recently conducted, which was, I think, a real highlight for myself and my team at the Annenberg School. We were commissioned by the Sundance Institute in Women in Film Los Angeles to look what I think is the largest undertaking of an independent space that's ever been done on gender and film. And what we did is we were asked to look at how females were doing behind the camera from 2002 to 2012 at the Sundance Film Festival. We looked at gender representation behind the camera in over 800 films and more than 11,000 people. So to give us a big picture idea of how women are doing across the festival, 11 years, here's what we found. And you'll see a couple of trends that are immediately apparent. The documentary space, no big surprise, is a place where females are actually thriving. Females are more likely to direct, write, produce, shoot, and edit, all in the documentary sphere. Okay? But as you can also see, there's some other interesting findings that I think pertain to one of my earlier slides. Across the board, female directors are doing better at the Sundance Film Festival than they're doing in commercial fare. Okay? And if we see here, almost 30% of all producers in the narrative space at the Sundance Film Festival across 11 years are female, and almost 50%, 46% in particular, of all producers of documentaries are female. Now, just like Rina mentioned earlier, cinematography is still a highly male-dominated arena, even at the Sundance Film Festival. Now, last for this study, and the final point I'd like to conclude on, is also for this investigation, we interviewed 51 content creators to ask them specifically what accounts for the lack of women behind the camera in the narrative space. Again, we showed them data that was available and asked them for their thoughts about why we're not seeing more women work behind the camera. 5 major impediments or barriers for women emerged across these interviews. These were based on perceptions, impressions, personal experiences, or the experiences of others. I'd just like to end on these 5 impediments. The first, our participants pointed to gendered financial barriers as an impediment for women working as directors and producers in the independent space. They pointed to the fact that funders are predominantly male, female content is perceived to not be commercially viable, and females are often perceived to be less confident and less trustworthy in the motion picture or the independent process. Secondly, and not worth really having to explicate, is that women face difficulty working in a male-dominated arena, as was stated before. 15.7% indicated being stereotyped on set, that there's a belief that women are perceived to lack the confidence to lead a large crew of men on set. Participants also reported that women were being objectified and stereotyped on set, factors that we know can undermine performance, confidence, and even aspirations in male-dominated arenas. Almost 20% pointed to the work-family balance and indicated that directing and producing were perceived to be antithetical to the demands of motherhood. And 13.7% pointed to exclusionary hiring practices in the narrative space. In particular, we were told that females simply lack the experience to carry some of the bigger budget films. And if you think about it, this last point actually makes a lot of sense. If you were to look at which we did, 1,100 films from 2002 to 2012. Only 41 women worked as directors. 65% of the stories that they told were in romance, comedy, and in drama. All the types of genres that have smaller budgets and do not give women the type of experience they need with visual effects to move on to direct action or tentpole type films. So in conclusion, females are still sidelined and sexualized on screen. Quite a bit of stereotyping and mythologizing not only affects who we see on screen, but who is also working behind the camera. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. I'm just going to introduce each of our panelists, and I think we can just kind of leap in, yeah? And just start the discussion around what does this mean, how different is this than any of your perceptions. So Laura Michalchyshyn is a producing partner with Robert Redford of Sundance Productions, speaking of Sundance. She's well known, I think, to Canadians. They've just borrowed her for a little while. She served as an executive vice president of programming and marketing at Sundance Channel, senior vice president of dramatic programming at Alliance Atlantis, where she was responsible for Showcase Television. And her bio is so long, I just had to kind of do all or nothing, right? So this is as close to nothing as you can possibly get in Laura's bio. Next to Laura is John Doyle. John is the Globe and Mail television critic, a position he's held since 2000. He's the winner of 2 Globe Awards, and he's written extensively about other subjects. One of his favorites is soccer. But he's been commenting on the decline in women's employment as actors in key creative jobs behind the camera. And recently he wrote something that I think is worth repeating. This is the most toxic issue in television right now. Women viewers are coveted by broadcasters and advertisers, and vast amounts of money are spent on creating shows to reach these viewers, yet the number of women involved seems to be diminishing. And I think that, in a nutshell, is what we're hearing. Ferne Downey, yay, Ferne, is an actor. Some of you may know her best from her performances, but she's also the president of ACTRA National. And she has been appointed or elected, I guess, this year as the president of FIA, the International Actors Association. And Ferne has been very involved in a number of innovative steps to advance conditions for all actors, certainly, but really taking a major step forward in terms of putting that kind of thinking into practice and asking ourselves what it means, this absence of diversity on screen, apart from the fact of the representation of the members of her association, which of course is foremost, but also what does it mean to all of us as consumers of Canadian culture. And so I think I'd just like to, do you want to leap in, Laura? Sure.
First of all, I'm very thrilled to be back and with this esteemed group, and thank you, Rina and Women in View. It's distressing. And I was actually at Dr. Smith's presentation at the Sundance Film Festival in January, and it was equally riveting then. It is distressing to hear these numbers, and it's interesting. I have a 17-year career, frankly, on the broadcast side as a programmer, and only in the last year have I become a producer. So I've jumped the fence, if you will, and partner with Robert Redford for Sundance Productions in New York and LA. What I think is really interesting, and you've said this, Rina, just now, is the fact is when we talk, and I'm now speaking as a broadcaster, women as an audience are a coveted audience. You only have to see the proliferation in Canada and the US of endless women's channels. There are new ones coming every day, whether it's channels like Slice, W, Own, We, Lifetime, Oxygen. I mean, like the list grows and grows. And there are now Yahoo channels and YouTube channels, projecting images and creating programming for women. It's shocking to see that, there are not nearly enough women making, creating, producing, directing, shooting, and writing our content. And I have to say, my personal professional experience has been very fortunate because I've had a number of, we've spoken this afternoon, of very strong mentors, both men and women, but a number of very, very strong women. I started at a young age. I was able to, follow my passion, follow my dream. I think one thing that is very interesting about the dynamic of, now I live in America, I've been there almost 10 years, of male and female creators, is that there is sort of a thought and a thinking that goes on in Hollywood primarily, that for whatever reason, women don't, and I'm just going to say it, don't have the balls. Frankly, in the room, it is a really interesting dynamic where women will sit at the back of a writer's room or back of a creative pitch, and you see it physically, and it just is, I think it is something that actually beyond, and it says it in this, it's just beyond the industry. It is something about the way we teach women around how to be present when it comes to confidence and in creative elements, really just sitting in that room and owning it. I have to say, my whole career, I've spent a lot of my time personally sitting beside the CEO, whether he or she, male or female, is at one end of the table or the other. I've learned in my career that the only way I'm going to get what I want to do, frankly, through and across, is to befriend the most powerful, most provocative, biggest thinker and person who can say yes. And so it's just been an adage. Whenever I tell young women and men what to do, I'm like, befriend the president CEO. I have a great long list of bosses in my past, and frankly, all of them have remained in my life. And the people I have frankly wanted to work with, collaborate with, work for, work beside, work under, have always been people that understand that good creative, visionary programming, great content comes from big ideas and big thinkers, not whether you're a man or a woman. And I just want to shout out, if Phyllis Yaffe is here, I have to say, she was one of my first very significant bosses with Norm Bolin. And there are many things that I remember working with Phyllis, but one great story is there was a series I was bringing in to pitch to Norm and Phyllis, and then I'll stop. And it was my first 6 weeks on the job at Showcase Television, and she had hired me from Winnipeg, and I had never been a VP of programming. I was at the Women's Television Network. I had the great honor of watching a channel launch from the beginning of license phase. We got it on the air. But I'll never forget, Phyllis said to me when I first started my job, and Norm Bolin, as well, but Phyllis was my first boss, she said, be brave, be bold, and never ever be afraid. So one day I walked in and I said, I found it. I found a program that's going to change the landscape of this little channel called Showcase, running 99% Canadian programming. We're looking for how to tell different stories. And it was a series called Oz. Tom Fontana had made a series called Oz for HBO in the US, and we had never bought a US series of that nature. And I walked in, and Phyllis had watched it, and I came in on a Monday or Tuesday morning and said, what do you think? And I'm 30 or 31. And she turned to me, and she threw it at me, and I docked. This is true. I docked, Phyllis. And then she said to me, this is going to make or break your career, and I think it's going to make it, and it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to be big, and it's going to be noisy, and you're going to have to stand up for it. And I said, I will. And frankly, that was a great lesson.
John, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rina. That's a good story, Laura. Thank you. I always wondered what went on behind the scenes. Now I know. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. The thing that surprised me about this report is the disgraceful low number of women working behind the scenes in Canadian television. As directors, as screenwriters, and in other areas, it shocked even me to actually see the numbers. And those of you who read my column will know that I'm often skeptical and sometimes cynical. And so if it shocked even me, the numbers are bad. But part of my contribution, I'll start with an anecdote. 2 or 3 years ago, I was having lunch with a Canadian TV executive, a woman, and she'd asked for this lunch for a chat. And then before the lunch, she said she was going to send me advance screeners of the first episodes of 2 new shows that she would be airing sometime after our lunch. And if I asked if I would watch them and give her, personal, off-the-record feedback at lunch. And I agreed to do that. It seemed fair if it was off the record. So I watched the two. One was fine. I didn't have a great deal to say about it. The other, I was taken aback when I watched it because there were 3 female characters on the show. One was, I noticed this straight away, it's like within 11 minutes, there were 3 female characters. One was an attractive woman who was a bitch. The other was a whiny, needy woman who was always complaining. And the third was a very mothering figure. And I thought, when I watched the show through and thought, that's just ridiculous. The characters on the show who are the least well-drawn, who are absolute cliches, are these 3 women. And then when I had lunch with the executive, she asked me for my feedback. And when we talked about this particular show, I told her bluntly what I've just said. And she said, the reason I sent it to you was because I felt exactly the same way when I saw it. And she said, very few people actually agreed with me. But when I brought in the creators, which was 3 men, into the room to discuss it, I said to them, don't any of you know any women? Like, do you have girlfriends, wives, mothers, sisters? Because the female characters here aren't like any women that I know. Now, she told me that was how she approached it too. So she was glad that I had sort of validated her opinion. It was too late by the time, according to her, that by the time it was finished to do much changing with that show. It went on the air. It didn't last very long. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You can play a guessing game. But what I noted afterwards was that it actually got pretty good critical reception, and mostly from male critics. There might have been 1 or 2 women who wrote about it. Didn't take it very seriously, but it gained this kind of reputation for being a really good show from a number of male critics who thought it was terribly witty, terribly dry, sometimes cutting in its humor, which it wasn't. It was ridiculous. That leads me to an observation, which I think is the truth. In Canadian television, there is a cabal of guys who look out for each other, who look after each other, who might never admit to blocking others, especially women, from jobs. Most of these guys are, some of them might be mildly talented, most of them are hacks or mediocrities, but they are powerful, and they are a cabal because they do look out for each other. And they get a lot of jobs in the business. And they get those jobs because they tend to be prominent, not because of big talent, but because they are often the loudest voice in the room. They are the ones who will sit on a committee, who will sit on a jury, who will, in whatever organization or guild or trade association they belong to, they're the ones who will put their hand up to take a leading role. They're the ones who will do the blogging, who will be on social media a lot, who will promote themselves and promote their friends a lot. And that is one of the reasons why I think these numbers are so shockingly bad for the number of women writers, directors, and in other roles in Canadian television, is because of that group. And that group will hold grudges, and it will organize campaigns to against certain people or shows they don't like. They will send anonymous complaints. They will do that kind of thing. And that's the simple reality, is that cabal does exist. Now, I don't think it's fair, in terms of making the situation better, I don't think it's fair to expect every woman involved in the industry, that is writers, directors, and so on, to always be the ones to sit on a committee, to sit on a jury, to put their hand up to take a leading role in some guild or trade or organization. I don't think it's fair to do that. Because it's simply, that means that they're being pushed into that, and they shouldn't need to be. I do think, though, in terms of making the situation better in Canadian television, I do think it is incumbent upon women who are in powerful positions to promote the work of other women, to make sure that women are fairly represented behind the scenes in Canadian television, especially when so much money, so much of it being taxpayers' money, is being spent. Recently, I wrote a column when Kirsten Stewart left the CBC, and the headline of the column, which did sort of sum it up, was Sexism, Spite, and Kirsten Stewart's Legacy at the CBC. And it was mainly about the amount of spite that was aimed at her that would not have been aimed at a male executive in the equivalent position. But what I found interesting was the response I got from inside the industry to that column. And it was a lot of people, both male and female, saying, no, I think you're wrong, actually. There are a lot of women who work in Canadian film and television. Excuse me. And then people kept pointing this out. You know, it's not fair to say that there's a lot of sexism. There are a lot of women who work some of them in powerful positions. So, I mean, my answer to that tended to be, well, if there are so many of them, what are they doing for women in the industry? And there are some who are powerful executives, who are producers, who run companies that spend millions creating shows, developing shows. And I do think that the best way forward is for the encouragement of those women in powerful positions to help others, to make sure that women are represented. I don't think there's any other way to make the situation better.
So my name's Ferne, Downey, and I'm an actor, and I'm also a union leader. So I have 22,000 members of ACTRA. And I kind of had to come at this a different way, because we looked at what we could do in terms of seeing our stories reflected on our screens in Canada. And so I spent a lot of time going to Ottawa and speaking to regulators and jostling with the CRTC and CMF and everybody else on the planet, because regulation is massive in our Canadian screen-based industry. It just simply is. So I often take young women, I take a very, gender-balanced team always to Ottawa. And I was really, really thrilled numbers of years ago when I started getting very young women opting in, like the Degrassi Next Generation young women and series leads in in current production shooting in Toronto and Montreal. And I realized things aren't as good as they can possibly be. I have got to use my power differently. I'm an influential union leader. What I can do is get the unions together. So this morning, we did our very fantastic launch of our Focus on Women 2013 report that got all of the unions behind the scenes in Canada to share their gender equality stats. What's real? What's the snapshot? Who's moving up the pipeline? Is it a sticky floor? How do actors get auditions for women after the age of 30? I mean, it's just unbelievable, the differences in key creative decision-making roles in particular. So Dr. Amanda Coles was our writer on this report, but it's meant to be somewhat shocking because it's just the truth. We're holding up the mirror, but we're not content to just hold up the mirror. We're going to change the mirror. So trying to work in concert with everybody to say, it can't go on this way. It's not right. My story's not being told, not just because I'm over 50 and have silver hair and I'm 5'9". I'm a woman, I'm a Canadian citizen, and I believe that we should do a much better job of getting those stories on the screen. So I really do want you to all read this. All read this. I'll say more later. Thanks.
So one of the things that when we have these kinds of discussions, either one-on-one or in this kind of a group setting, that people tend to say is, why? Why is it, were things not getting better for a while? And or was that an illusion, or has something changed? And if so, what is it that's changed? And does this mean it's just part of our structure? This is the way it is. And we've seen some of the arguments, but I'd be curious to know from any of you that want to leap in, what do you think is different now, or what do you think led to this kind of degenerating pattern? Okay.
Are you speaking of representation or employment, or both?
I think I'm talking about both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the question comes either way.
Well, I think there's a lot of misnomers. I think Dr. Smith mentioned very rightly that there's a misnomer among powerful, and I'll just say studio/channel/ network execs, both here and in the US, that male skewed or male produced or male dominated programming is far more successful. I mean, you see that, look at the summer temp polls of any country, and what do we have? It's all the, it's the superheroes, it's classic kind of male skewed programming and feature films. And I think what we're realizing, and is that frankly, in our business, the business I'm in, which is television, is money is primarily made by advertising, advertising and ticket sales, of course. And what's very interesting is all the research says women are buying a lot of the programming and the content that is being advertised. A lot of the, decision making is in the female hands around what we're buying when it comes to our entertainment and then the products that are being advertised. So there's a disconnect. I think there's some interesting stats, and I'm not sure if they relate in Canada, but lately, in our business and television, there's a lot of female executives who run programming departments, a lot of female executives who run marketing departments, and even female executives who run channels. But what's interesting is that tends to dominate cable. So cable channels, and I just listed a number of women's cable channels, there are a lot of female execs, but we frankly get put onto female-type programming. Big studios, big media companies, when you look across the Fortune 500 landscape, frankly, are typically the CEOs and the shareholders are men. And I think that is a very big, you asked the reason why, and I think that's across, our whole business, North America. It is because the biggest decisions are being made by the men in power. And it is, that's just a reality. But what's interesting is in New York, where I live, we have worked hard. There's a group of female execs who are both creative, like producers and programmers, and then running channels, and some very strong, powerful women. A couple of people who here in Canada and the U.S., are now saying, okay, we are now taking over. A good friend of mine, Nancy Dubuque, was recently named CEO of all the A&E networks, which is a coup because she's now probably the 6th most powerful CEO in the cable and media landscape in America. And you're going to see change because she believes in a different way. So I think it's also, we are going to just have to continue getting the big jobs. It's really true. It's hard, but I have a lot of friends who say, Laura, what is your goal? And I said, I'm not going to stop until I'm done. Who knows? I'm running a company with one of the most biggest visionary, iconic individuals in America. I'm very privileged. With a company that has a great brand. And it's programming I believe in, but I'm not stopping yet. I'm going to continue because I love what I do. It's a passion. I have the fire in the belly, and why not aspire to run Time Warner or Comcast or one of the big Hollywood studios? Why not?
All of the above.
I think part of the problem, certainly in Canada, is that in television, apart from the CBC, the 3 big players are Rogers, Bell, and Shaw. Those aren't broadcasters. That's the phone company, the cable company, satellite delivery company. The amount of people who are powerful in commercial Canadian television now, who are actually broadcasters, is declining. There is, I think, in those 3 companies, there is a much greater emphasis on following the format, the tried and true. There is a deep reluctance to waver from what worked in the US 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, there was a real adherence to formats that they believe work. There is less creativity, and when there is less creativity, that means that there is less true reflection of the country, its population, the number of men, women. All of those issues are not reflected as easily or indeed as well in a circumstance where you have fewer creative people at the top in charge.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of different factors operating, and I'd just like to illuminate with the story in my work with the Geena Davis Institute. What Geena Davis is trying to do is change the prevalence and stereotyping of females in entertainment targeting 0 to 11-year-olds. So we go to, a lot of times, the studios around town. I'll do a presentation of the research on what we found, and then there will be a conversation about, well, why do these numbers look the way that they do? It's a little bit of a different approach. And I think that in some of the data, thinking about the aggregate of characters, so not lead characters, not even really secondary characters, which only represent a fraction of all characters in movies. If the typical movie features 40 characters, the principal and secondary characters that drive the story, there are not many of them, okay? So most characters are actually background characters, okay, the tertiary characters. And so we were presenting to a studio these numbers and saying, well, why is this so low? And a notable individual raised their hand and was talking about animation. He said, well, when I'm drawing a scene, you know, I'm drawing all these men, he said, and some of them are smart and some of them are dumb, some of them are heavy, some of them are thin, you know, some of them are athletic. But when I draw the woman, she has to be beautiful and sexy and smart. And then he stopped himself and he said, oh my gosh, I'm the problem. And it never dawned on him that he was only drawing one woman in a whole sea of men. And so I think that some of these are very implicit biases that we often operate in, and then, you know, it might be sitting at the back of the table, right? And that we need to challenge these cultural stereotypes and notice not just the blatant offensive, but the bigger picture of what's going on culturally. Women running companies, you know, women not opting out, a flexible work environment to accommodate differences. So it's really, I think, thinking about the bigger picture and all the places of resistance where people can advocate for change.
So I'm gonna ask the inflammatory question here. Quota or no quota? We talked this morning about, for example, in Sweden and I believe a couple of other Scandinavian countries, there's a law, if I'm not mistaken, it's a law, Ferne, or a policy, in any case, where government funds are spent, no more than 60, no more than 40% can go to either sex, right? So that means not that you can't do a show about hockey with all males, or that you can't do a show, you know, I don't know what, about a hair salon with all women, but that over the course of the year, there has to be a balance in where federal public monies are spent. And that's been talked about increasingly. They feel they've had significant success with that. It feels to some people too much like a quota, and quota feels to some people like too much of a censoring mechanism. But I wonder if it isn't time to somehow impose some sort of measurable standards that has money behind it, that ensures that there's a greater, that Canadian content looks like Canadians, you know, in the society around us, that this pluralistic society that we're so proud of actually is reflected when we talk about Canadian content.
Well, I sure think it's helpful to have people stand up and explain themselves. I've been loving reading in the local papers the last week about some of the boardroom governance practices that are being discussed now in terms of comply or explain. Either increase the number of women you have on your corporate board governance, or tell us why not. What is the trouble? What are you doing to encourage people to step up, to lean in, whatever metaphor you want to use? So in Scandinavia, they've have, quite a, different governance structure, and they have fooled around more with the 60-40, 40-60. But they've also been way smarter in terms of complaining about these roles are stereotypical roles that I'm seeing on my television. Those aren't the kind of roles I want to play as an actor. Those aren't the kind of roles I want to see my kids exposed to in terms of female role models. So they've been bossier. They've just been pushier in terms of saying, we don't think that this is an acceptable level of discourse on our public broadcasting system. So I'm proud of them. I'm not, I think it's 2013. I think it's so systemic. We've got to change everything. Everything. How we tell our stories to each other, who's telling the stories. ACTRA Toronto Women's Committee has been just kick-ass in terms of building toolkits for saying, seize the means of production. We got to get more women willing to tell stories. We've got to get more people in the swim. So I'm not necessarily a quota girl. It worked many decades ago in Canadian music. I think we're a different world now. Our digital revolution has changed everything, and I think we can do it differently. But that's me.
So to channel Tina Fey, bitch is the new black? Yes?
I would be against the quota system simply because it makes the public very skeptical about what they're seeing. And that's the kind of thing that I think sometimes inside the Canadian film and television industry, it's forgotten that, there was an audience. It's not all about, I know there are reasons why people get very wrapped up in policy, in funding issues, all of those things. But sometimes it is forgotten that there's an audience. You do want to reach an audience, a mass audience, if is preferable. And that audience will be skeptical of quota system. And if you're talking about some kind of quota system in Canadian film and television, the first thing that the audience will be aware of and that critics will point out is that there isn't one in the United States. So why are we doing this? I think, I think just in terms of the consumer, the audience, it's a bad idea. What does work is, as you mentioned, simply pointing out that there aren't enough women employed. The instance you cited of, or maybe it was Ferne, about the boards, about women being represented on the board of directors of major companies. I think the Globe and Mail has been, instrumental in pointing that out. And it is so. It's more about to succeed. It's more about pointing fingers and exposing than it is about quotas.
And I completely agree. I think incentives are great. I think there's a lot of training programs and university programs that public and private sector should support with young women coming up in the ranks, and we should be encouraging women to try cinematography and set design and production design, typically more male skewing careers. I think that starts at school and at a younger age as well, encouraging women who are interested in film, that there are these vast array of opportunities in television and film and storytelling and writing and encouraging. So I think it's also incentive-based. And then I love success begets success. So you look at a series, like Girls, Lena Dunham on HBO. You look at, Bridesmaids. You look over in the UK at even films that have strong female leads, that have strong female stories, that are, whether they're comedies or dramas or tragedies or horror films, they are working. There's a great series on BBC called Orphan Black that is Canadian lead. What's her name, John? Tatiana
Maslany.
She's
yes.
amazing,
yes.
And is making waves around the world. I think the more women's stories that are told that are successful and they rate, and that's the world I live in, ratings and audiences, the more we'll be able to convince the final, decision makers and the studios and the people with the money that these kinds of stories actually not just need to be told, they're successful, they work. Kristen Wiig writing more features and directing. We just need more and more and more, and the more success there is. I'm a big believer that people go, we want more of that. We're also a bunch of sheep in our industry. We see one success and we all go running after it. It's just, you see a Western work, all of a sudden for 2 years you're going to have 10 or 15 Westerns. You see, I guarantee you, Sex and the City, how many women sort of ensemble dramas did we have in comedies? It's just, that's what happens. And it's, it can feel sometimes repetitive, et cetera, but, it's how our industry works.
And I'd just like to add two attributes that we really need to think about. One is socialization practices. How are parents contributing to the technological divide that boys and girls grow up with? And how will smartphones and iPhones really affect girls' technology and use over time, which can directly affect going into this creative industry. Secondly, I think we need a realistic sense of interest and desire among women. The documentary findings from the festival were so provocative because I think it's 6 out of 11 years, females comprised almost half of the documentary directors, which shows high level of interest for females to direct. So I think I would want to back up and say, where are those women going and when are they being funneled? Do they choose documentary or are they being funneled to documentary? And where does that begin? Is it in film school? Are they receiving messages? And so I think that research needs to be done in North America, really understanding the socialization to women behind the camera. Are they being pushed to producing rather than directing? I don't think we know at this point in time, and that would be really important data to think about. Transparency, I love that idea, all before we start thinking about mandating anything.
So this is a good, I think, opportunity to bring the audience into these questions. And I have to comment on 2 points that I'd love people to jump in on. One is that we do have data around schools. Women are trained exceedingly well, graduate with exceedingly high success rates in a lot of these technical things. So there's kind of a black hole after school. So, one of the catchphrases at a previous conference was, we're trained within an inch of our lives. Can we just have a job now? Right? So that's one thing. And then I think that trying to figure out where in the cycle you intervene in terms of what is the thing, if people are going to school, if they're demonstrating the desire, if they're demonstrating the capacity. I'd love to get back to the question of budgets, which a couple of you have mentioned, because my theory on why women do so well in documentary is because we're allowed to. It's simply more possible because you get paid less. Usually your money is in there. You're financing yourself. I mean, I think that's a big generalization, but it's like my world, so I get to make it. But, what do you guys think? Okay.
I can lend mine out.
I'm just going to introduce you because Mary Henriksen, who's about to speak, is one of 6 women who participated in a program called Creative Leaders, and I think 5 of the 6 of them are actually here with their what we called sponsors. So it was a program to see if we could break through the glass ceiling of women who were accomplished, trained, up there, but we thought had a lot further to go in their careers than we were seeing the advancement. So sorry, Mary, to lay that on you, but...
I have a bit of a...
There you go.
There we go. I think it's on now.
Is it on?
Yes.
Here we go. Okay.
We're going to try to make them really, really short.
Yes. It comes to, there was a kind of a incident recently when Star Trek came out, and there's a scene, Alice Eve, I believe the actress's name, Damon Lindelof, who wrote the script, got a lot of grief because basically she comes out in her underwear. She's supposed to be like kind of a ranking person on the starship and everything, but it had to get into theaters for people to actually say, what is this woman being portrayed in her undies? My question is, did none of the people who worked on the movie up until that place who saw it ever say anything? Why did it have to get to public release before anyone complained about the portrayal of a woman in power on screen?
Looking at me. I think it's a rhetorical question. I think that's a good question. I think we have a question here.
Thank you. My name is Valerie Kalin. I teach at Ryerson University. I was quite taken by the devolution of status of women in just 211 and 212. And my personal question to myself as I've been watching the news is how it is that the media is now reporting on heinous crimes against women and children. It's certainly in the last 2 years. And I wonder if anybody's done a study of a correlation between perhaps the warmongering globally at this time and its reflection in the entertainment industry.
I don't know. Can anybody comment on it? I think, what we do know is that, we recognize that there are issues in employment in all industries, or let's say most industries, gendered one way or another. And one of the reasons that apart from the fact that we work there, that we're so passionate about media is its role as that borderline, right? So that the imbalance behind the screen plays out as we consume that information, consume those images, and it goes round and it goes round. So, I think those are hard things to prove one way or another, but we all have our speculations about it.
Hi, this has been a fabulous panel. Thank you so much. I have a question around measuring and benchmarking. Within the media landscape, we always say what gets measured gets done. So I'm a little bit curious about the reluctance around setting targets, and extremely firm targets, if that's our general kind of operating principle around virtually everything else that we do in our work. It's always about measurements. And especially if if public funding is going towards institutions, why wouldn't we demand that that funding be distributed in a way that represents all of us in all sorts of roles within the media?
I think we'll go for measurement, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that CUES is going to do for sure is request, gender-based breakdowns on all of the work that comes through CMF, Telephone Canada. We're going to make these requests. We want all the data. We've only begun our data exploration. And I think annual reportage and shining light on things will escalate to a point where we don't get action. If we don't make a systemic change, then there will be next steps that one could take. But I don't think we're there yet.
But I just wonder if we haven't been in that place for long enough.
That's a good question, too.
I don't think you have, actually. I mean, I don't think the bright enough light has been shone on the kind of figures that you find in this report and that have been presented today. And there isn't enough measurement. You might feel inside the industry where you deal with a lot with regulation, regulatory bodies, funding issues, that sort of thing, that there's a lot of measurement being done. And there isn't certainly that the press or the public is aware of. And that, I think, is a good part of the way forward, is to make any measurement known and make sure that it's known.
Oh my goodness. Questions everywhere. Yes. Do we only have one? Maybe we can share.
Yeah, someone can take mine. I'll share.
Yeah, we can share.
We can share up here.
Get the questions up fast.
Hi, here's a super quick question. I work a lot in the documentary and factual side of the business, and I notice that factual has been not measured in this particular survey. And by the way, thank you so much for doing this survey. It makes me very, very sad to see those numbers, because I'm 47 now, and when I was 20, I went to a very similar panel, probably with some of the same women in this room. It was sponsored by ACTRA. It was about women directing, and it was about as bleak then as it is now. I would be very interested to see what the numbers look like on the factual side, because I suspect, like you, Rina, that in fact what happens is that women achieve a certain amount of success, and then they end up in the pink-collar ghetto of factual, which can be lucrative, no question about it, but is nowhere near as lucrative as the narrative side. So I guess my question is, has anybody measured it?
As far as I know, we have only sort of general anecdotal stuff. I think WIFT Toronto did the best job a couple of years ago in their Framework 2 report, but we don't really have it year after year. We do have, I think, enough evidence to say that where the budgets are less, the women are more prominent, so that there's where the prestige is greatest, where the money is the greatest, so that's where you'll see the fewest women. And there's another important metric, I think, that we've observed time after time, and which is particularly interesting, I think, to documentary, and that is where a jury is based on content or quality, women apply in greater numbers, and they succeed almost 50%, if not greater. So when we looked at what used to be called the Canadian Non-Theatrical Fund for documentary, it was parity. Where you look at things that are completely driven by commerce, it's a very different story, and there the metric of budget really comes in. And when you add that to the imbalance in terms of what Stacy was saying about how well marketed and how much marketing money goes into a production written or directed by a woman, you see how that the cycle kind of eats itself and propels itself. So it's all of those nesting eggs, I think. Up there, yeah.
Yeah, here.
Oops, there you go.
Just a couple of things just to remark. The program that I ran for 15 years was jury-based and was very low budget. And nevertheless, when I looked at gender, 20% of those who applied as directors were women. It wasn't nowhere near 50%, but it was a much higher number nevertheless for producers. So I definitely came away with the impression that women saw themselves as capable of nurturing and realizing the vision of the men whose work they wanted to produce. In terms of the panel, Laura, you're the only one who's at the moment in the position of greenlighting projects. Are you, and I realize it's been 1 year in the current position, are you keeping track of women, when you're receiving projects, or?
It's a good. Well, I will now for sure when I think about it. Here's what's really interesting is I spend 20%, if not close to 20% of my time mentoring and giving counsel and advice to young women in and around Canada, the U.S. about working in the industry. It's a fact. It shocks me. My in-basket is 20% women saying, "Can you help me with a reference? Can you introduce me? Can you give me a lead?" And I frankly, I'm honored. I'm thrilled to do it. It takes a lot of bloody time. There are days when I'm like, okay, I gotta sell a show. I gotta choose a writer. I have to greenlight, and say, yes, we're doing this program. What it says to me is, for whatever reason, there just isn't enough resources for women. There aren't enough senior women out there who are, for whatever reason, able to give counsel, advice, mentorship, sponsorship, etc. So what is interesting is I have proactively, and again, I'm partnered with someone who has a big vision, and he truly, you've seen the stats at Sundance, that is his vision, frankly, even though, it's years and years later, and there are many amazing programmers at the festival. We tell stories of, we tell great, big stories of the human condition, and our interest is in that, and it does cross boundaries of men and women and gays and lesbians and, diversity. What's really interesting is I will bring a project to his attention, and it would frankly be a project that many other very senior producers and creators might go, oh, that will never get made. And his reaction will be, I love her. I put her in this movie. She's an awesome talent. I'm so glad we're doing this. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, now I have to go make this happen. So, it is also around, I think, very much so I am very, and there's been a lot of very talented women that have come to me. I'm really thrilled. I've got about 6 projects that are being created, directed, a combination by women, including some documentaries, so that, pertains. But I've got the great benefit of being able to make some phone calls, and because I have very strategically chosen this position. I took 17 years of being a programmer, and I very strategically said, if I'm going to go out on the other side, I want to go out and do it in a position of power. It really was very carefully, for me, conceived, because I know how hard it is to be an independent producer of television and film. And I know that no one, it's a thankless position, frankly, if you're starting out and you're new. So, at some point, there was a decision I made, but I have to say, we are always in our business, in television, we're always looking for the greatest story. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, there is this wrong, kind of understanding or belief that for whatever, men tell bigger, bolder, noisier, more successful stories. So my job is kiboshing that. So I walk into very senior programming meetings with a lot of women around me, and, they have to listen because, frankly, we're right. Take care.
Thank you
for being here. Well done.
Yes, one of the great leaders. Yes.
I know that Mr. Doyle had talked about, I guess this kind of has to do with what was just said, but you talked how it's most important for women in powerful positions to do for other women in the industry. And I guess this is a naive 2-part question, sort of, but what about the men? Is there anything that they can do as well, or is there any responsibility put on men in leadership powers, or positions of power, to hire more women, or, I don't know, is the responsibility only on women in those positions?
No, it's an interesting question. Thank you. No, obviously, the onus is not only on women, but I do think it helps if women who are in positions of power realize that it is incumbent upon them to not just to hire other women, to mentor them, to nourish their careers, all of that. It's not really about that. It's about women who are in positions of power ensuring that in a production that they are in charge of, there aren't 2 women and 19 men working on it. And it's also incumbent upon them, I think, to point out to men who are in powerful positions too, that this needs to be done. It's obviously not just about women. The point needs to be made about men too, and 2 men in positions of power. I can't greenlight anything. I just write for the newspaper, but I do what I can.
I think we're really out of time because I know two of our panelists have to race to the airport, having come a long way to be with us today. But let's have two more questions, and then those who haven't had a chance, we're going to be out in the lobby and at Luma, and you're very welcome to come and continue the dialogue. I wish you would. Yes. Do you have a... Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Sorry, I shouldn't have said yes. Sorry.
Hi there. My name is Angelica Liscan, and I'm a stunt performer and a stunt coordinator. Hi, Ferne. I just have a comment and then a question for the doctor. We were talking about producers and with the producers and how many women were producers and, having women producers helping us out. I've noticed that it has a lot to do also with the production managers. Me being a female and being a stunt coordinator and coming from a background of stunt performing. When you send in your CV, when a new show comes to town, you wait for the phone call. So the production managers are the ones who pick who they'd like to come in, usually guys that they've worked with before, people that they've dealt with before. So there's a show that I really wanted, and, I've been doing this for 3 years. I know I can do it. It's a feature film. I want to do this film. They would not call me in. I called, I emailed, whatever I could do. I went down. No, they're not calling me in. So I took matters into my own hands, and I found the director's contact, and I sent it to him. And I said, I want to do this movie, and this is why, and I got called in. Got called in, had the meeting, got the show. So now I go into the production manager, and of course I'm like, oh my God, he's going to be so mad. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know I just have to go in, do my thing. I go in, sits me down. So now we have to talk about money. So I say, this is my rate. Well, that's a lot of money. Well, not really. That's actually the going rate. Not really. Would you give Matt Berman that rate? Would you give this guy that rate? Would you give John Stoneham Jr. that rate? Yeah. Well, then you have to give it to me too because I'm doing the same job. Gave me the rate, shook my hand, and on the way out, he said, congratulations. Good for you for getting the job. With that being said, that doesn't happen. I got very lucky that I had that chance. How do we reach out to these production managers more, and how can women get in there? There's 3 of us now that coordinate in Toronto. There should be more. I'm hoping to get some of my girls out there to do that. How do we do it without becoming too aggressive? I know there's a line of being aggressive and trying to get what you need. With women, when you're too aggressive, sorry, we're bitch. When you're a man, this guy's awesome. He's so aggressive. He goes after what he wants. How do you navigate that? And then my question really quickly, I'm sorry for the doctor, is when you did your study, were there any numbers on stunt coordinator females?
No, and I'm sorry about that because I did a presentation at Women in Film Los Angeles. They had an event, and immediately afterwards, a stunt coordinator, female, came up to me and said, "Can we talk? Can you do a study?" Right? So be on the lookout. We're in conversations, and that's often how the research gets done. People bringing questions to us because there's a void, and the void hasn't been filled numerically, and that often is the first step to raising awareness to evoke change.
And just to speak briefly to your comment, I think you're entirely right in identifying that factor of practice. I mean, I think to be fair, it's a high risk industry. It's a time of great financial insecurity. And I think all of us who are in those hiring positions, when you are in those hiring positions, there's a default position to go to who you know and who you've worked with and who you can rely on and who you can be candid with and those sorts of things. I don't think that's the main source of the problem, but I think that's a real factor. But one of the things we want to do that's been identified with Q's and ACTRA and Women in View is we're really hoping to be able to put together the funding in the next few months to develop what we're describing as a toolkit and checklist. So that is just a set of really simple tools that could be distributed to every person who's in a decision-making position, whether they're whether they're casting and they forgot that there's a step, so somebody in a wheelchair certainly couldn't take this accessible position, so-called, or whether they just default. So, and there's been some really interesting models of this. So it's just a series of questions, like you were saying, explain. So who did you consider? How did you consider these? Who are you not considering? Are you drawing from the greatest pool of talent? And so just kind of balancing that conservatism about risk, which is a real thing, with, think about this. Let's think about this. Let's break. So for the people who are willing and have that openness, then it just breaks through a little bit more. It's just one thing, but I think it could be very helpful. And I think we have one more question. Yeah, did you? Oh my God. Yes, you've been waiting.
All right. Cool.
You can talk loud.
Yeah, I'll get told for it anyway. I do want to thank you for this report. I do commend you. You need to speak truth to power, so having measurements is always useful to come at that. Specifically about domestic versus international, and talking about big professional tentpole films and stuff, where again influences the way we see people and representation in media and stuff. So I love the stat you talked about saying that that having a guy or girl as a lead character does not influence, I think, domestically what happens. However, and this is me coming from a diverse background, a lot of people come to me saying, well, the reason why these big tentpole features aren't diverse, either gender-wise or diverse-wise, is because we have to think about the international audience, although something like Fast and Furious seems to have this post-racial thing. I wonder, is the international audience, like thinking about that, is that also like a barrier of people saying this is why we can't have female characters in these big tentpole features? Is it the truth? If it's not, how do you say it's not? And if it is, this idea of the international audience being not as enlightened, and so we have to appeal to them, how do we combat it? So I just want to know whether or not, is it something that comes up, or is it not something that comes up?
In terms of what we found, which was looking at 2007 films, when you control all those other factors, the gender of the lead character domestically, there was no significant difference. For the international box office, if you had a female lead, you actually made more money. Okay, what happens internationally, though, right? Dialogue-heavy films don't translate. So 2007, the year we did the study, there were quite a few action gals in our lineup, right? So it's about what travels and doesn't require a lot of interpretation. That's my view as an empiricist. The content creators on the panel may have a different interpretation.
The expert. It's a good question. It's interesting. I think whoever says we have to think about international is actually just not knowing that's an excuse, frankly, because they haven't done the homework. What plays in Britain does not play in India, does not play in Germany or France. That's a ridiculous thing. I think what plays, really, I think there are genres that play better. That we know certain kinds of programming and certain kinds of movies have more appeal in different countries and around the world. But whether it's a female, male lead, et cetera. Interesting, you name Fast and Furious. It's directed by Justin Long, who is, he's Asian. And by the way, he put in Asian characters, and that film is breaking box office records. So I think, to my point earlier, success will help. I mean, there was a great article in Variety about him, and he just said, I'm the most unlikely superpower car. He said, I'm 5'2", I'm 122 pounds, and I'm like, I don't look like anyone on this lot. He said, some guy asked me if I could help, find the bathroom the other day because they thought I was a janitor. So it is breaking stereotypes, racial stereotypes, the gender stereotype, diverse stereotypes, et cetera. It really is important. And it was great because he just said, what his answer was? He's like, I don't know where the bathroom is, but I know where the editing suite is, and actually, I know where. And he named the president of the studio. He's like, I know where his office is. And then this guy realizing what he'd just done, it was like, sorry. It was a great answer. I thought, good for you, Justin. Very well said.
I'm sure that, like me, you're dying to hear the rest of the questions and engage in a dialogue. And unfortunately, we have to call this to an end. I'm so pleased that you were all able to come out and join us in what I hope is going to be the first in a series of really important discussions. And please join me in thanking this just stellar panel.